introduction, and welcome everyone. Wow, what a great panel, hey? Really, really looking forward to this today. I find it really interesting that we're going to be talking about communications and how Japan should be communicating itself, but we've slotted this into the politics sessions. And I think that's an indication of how important communication is in the political dynamic of today. What I want to do today is use the great panelists we have to discuss a key question. And that question is, in the world we live in today, in the post-COVID or with COVID world, in this very complex geopolitical construct that we have, particularly in the Asian region, and in a world where trust is depleted, trust in organizations is depleted, and generally we have much greater diversity of thought, the ability of people to, much greater ability of people to communicate their opinions and feedback through social media. In this new complex world, does Japan need to be communicating to the world in a different way? That is the key question that we want to examine today. Is Japan understood? Are the initiatives that Japan is sponsoring, is the great work that Japan is doing in its companies, its organizations, as well as the government, really being understood by the rest of the world? And that's the question we would like to examine today. And we have, of course, the view from Richard, whose firm works with a lot of governments, and Richard Edelman is very famous for their trust barometer. We have Kono-san, who can talk from his experience as Foreign Minister, Defense Minister, and obviously a long time in politics, and now in his role as head of the PR for the LDP. Kana can present the perspective of the media, and Billie the perspective of corporates. So let's just go into that first question. Does Japan need to do a better job of communicating with the world, or are we doing an okay job? Richard, from the outside perspective, how do you see that?
I'll unmute myself. So we actually track trust in national brands, and this data is about the extent to which brand Japan on the jersey of Takeda or Astellas or any of the other Japanese companies helps or hurts in various regions of the world. There are 4 or 5 data points I want to cover for you. Of the 25 countries that we survey globally, Japan peaked in 2019 at 68% trust, which is quite high, equivalent to Canada, Switzerland, Holland, then fell by 2021 to 59%. In APAC, it peaked at 72%, went down to 64%. In Europe, substantially less. Started in 2016 to 49%, got to 57%, went to 49%. So effectively looked like a V, up and then back down in Europe to 49%. In North America, including the US, it went from 51 to 61, then down to 53 by 2021. In Latin America, the highest of any region, hardly any change, 80% in 2019, but a 10-point drop in 2021. So from 2016 to 2019, flat, and then drop. China, a significant jump from 2016, 56 to 70, then down to 57. So again, a V-shaped figure. Korea, your traditional problem country, trust-wise, from 34 to 45, and then down to 23. So 22-point drop in 2 years, probably something to do with the semiconductors and for the phones and things. And then in the US alone, went from 47 to 60 and then down to 52. So what I will tell you is there was great anticipation of the Olympics, that Japan was seen on the move, and those 2 years and the Olympics happening but sort of limping through them was a problem. The change in administration from Abe now to Fumio is a big drop. I mean, you had a huge superstar kind of CEO kind of approach, and now the prime minister is not very well known. And so those are the big factors that I see, Ross.
So, Richard, when you talk about the expectation for the Olympics and the slump that we've seen after that, is that coming from a sense of stagnation, that Japan is just not on the move anymore, do you think?
You know, I went to Milan to the expo in 2015, 2016, and the Japanese pavilion was the best one of any because it showed sustainability. It showed you have this unbelievable digital arts company that did the exhibition where you looked like you were in a rice field, and everybody was stunned also by the idea that you could have, in a sense, automatically delivered food at the end. No people. So you had sort of several lines of superiority. And then the Olympics happened, and I don't know, just sort of, there was no message out of the Olympics. There was no green message. There was no automation message. There was no, it was just kind of, we limped through it. And it was just, I'm not saying that it's Japan's fault. Listen, God knows COVID was like the curse of the world, but it just completely buried the message, whatever that was.
Okay, thanks very much. Like to move, so that's from the outside view, and like to move a little bit in closer, and then finally get Kono-san's opinion on this. Kana-san, what do you think on this? Does Japan do a good job?
Yeah, so I think it is true that Japan's importance is definitely rising, whether it's in regional security or economic security. But one of the issues is Japan hasn't been as aggressive in communicating that, and I don't know whether it's to do with the cultural sort of, it's seen as a virtue not to boast, obviously, your strength. And so there's always this passive attitude that if I'm doing something good, whether it's in the politics or corporate world, I think a good example, for example, is like climate change, environmental efforts, and sustainability efforts. We're doing really good things. If we explain these, then people will understand. But actually, you need to be much more targeted in your messaging and say, I have this one killer technology that might actually change how we deal with climate change. And so I think it's also the same, for example. I think another good example, for example, is like, Prime Minister Kishida has, he's focused on strengthening Japan's national economic security. And they talk about, building a self-sufficient supply chain, which is an issue across the world. And one of the strategies that Japan is trying to take is that because they can't supply all their technologies on their own, they want to work with friendly nations, democratic nations, to get the technologies that they don't have in exchange for some of the technologies that Japan is really strong at. But then the question comes to, so what is it that Japan is really strong at that it can offer the world? A lot of the focus on the economic security, particularly within Japan, the debate has been about the decline of Japan's semiconductor industry. But I think if the messaging has been more on, for example, we're strong in materials, equipment, I know people notice, but this is where our strength is, and we can use this to leverage that strength, for example. And I think that's part of the strategy in how they persuaded Taiwan's TSMC to come here. But it could have been done in a more positive narrative if it wasn't so focused on decline of Japan's semiconductor industry. So in that way, I think sometimes that even if you're doing good things, you can't expect the world to just understand it. You really need to explain that this is where we're strong at, and this is how we want to promote it to the world.
Great. When I was at Edelman, we did some work into different national communication styles. And this is a very complex area, but the conclusion we came to is that in the West, the communication style is very much about the speaker's responsibility to convince the listener. And so we tend to be targeted in our messages. We tend to be very focused on logic and rhetoric as a way of putting it through. And you can see that very clearly in PowerPoint presentations done by Westerners, where you have a few lines, what are the key points here? In the East, Asia, and particularly in Japan, we feel that it's more about the listener's responsibility to interpret what the speaker is saying, and that's why you have those concepts in Japan, ain no kokyu, sontaku, and all this other stuff going on. So the style tends to be, we'll give you a dump of information, and you can interpret it as you want. And so the things that you're referring to, the targeting and the highlighting of particular issues doesn't happen. And you can see that in PowerPoint presentations as well. The Japanese PowerPoint presentations done by companies tend to be a whole lot of arrows and shapes and colors and a lot of text. And it's, you go through that and pick out what you think is the most important point. So I think there is a big difference in those communication styles. But if we're communicating with the world, yes, we do need to be more targeted and highlighting what those key messages are, rather than just hoping the rest of the world will understand. Billie, Rakuten's doing some really great things and has some great initiatives to sort of communicate what they're doing. How do you think that Japanese corporates should be looking at this?
I think it's definitely a very big question. I wanted to go back to what Kana was saying, though, that I think Japan often turns to established templates and established formats for communication. So I was thinking before the panel, early in my career, I remember being sat down by a CFO and being told, you must do this press release in the template provided by the Tokyo Stock Exchange, and there's no way you can challenge that. There's no way you can do it in any way different. And it turns out that's not like 100% true. I mean, of course there are templates and there are rules, and we need to follow the rules about financial disclosure. Please don't get me wrong there. But there is room for clear communication, and there is room for a message, and there is room for providing context. And as you said, Ross, it's about the speaker's responsibility. How do we give the context to the person who's not so familiar with your company or not so familiar with the Japan market to understand why the company is making this pivot at this time? And I mean, I'm very lucky. I have a company where from the CEO to the senior executive group, people are very passionate about trying to communicate clearly and trying to communicate in English and in a global sort of language. That doesn't mean that our Japan customer is not the most important thing when we're thinking about the local business. But yeah, I have a CEO who's out there on social media, who's willing to sort of take a stand on different issues. And we've been lucky enough to be able to put together events where you can bring in CEOs from around the world. One we did just last month was Rakuten Optimism. We had CEOs from Intel, from Qualcomm, from Accenture, from Zoom, engaging with our executives. And the whole purpose of that is not just to sort of showcase Rakuten, it's to address bigger issues, to talk about sustainability, to talk about workplace change, to talk about diversity. And being able to engage on that global stage, I think, is really pretty special, and perhaps we don't do enough of it yet.
It's a really interesting initiative because a lot of companies and governments, and I think even the ministries perhaps, tend to think that they need to be communicating something and that they need to be the speaker. But I increasingly feel in the world today, there is an equally important role to be the platform for a discussion. And what Rakuten is doing really, really well is bringing all those experts together, all those different perspectives, and creating a platform that discusses global issues. And I think that's really powerful, that sort of collaboration or chorus of spokespeople. And it does reflect back on Rakuten in terms of your branding. And so it's not only just about what we're saying and how we're saying it, it's about whether we can also be providing a platform for a discussion. Kono-san, any perspectives from you? Does the government, first of all, do you think the government thinks we're doing a good job of communicating Japan, or that there's a general sense that we need to be doing better?
Well, I guess after Fukushima, I get a lot of interview from the foreign press, and I realized that we were opposition then, but the government wasn't communicating well what the hell's going on in Fukushima. So people are really concerned about what's going on in Fukushima. Well, the government has spent a lot of effort and money on the history issue and territorial issue. It is important, but that's not it. So we need to come up with, well, strategy, target, and all those things. The Japanese government is either anti-foreign press we were told not to come to the Foreign Correspondent Club for interview because they, some minister said something wrong at their press conference. So we were told that Foreign Correspondent Club is off limit. And I thought that was a bit strange, so I actually went there because they give you honorary membership for a year, and that's kind of a good thing. The government has sort of a press officer who does deal with the foreign press, but as head of LDP PR bureau, I realized there's nobody in LDP PR side to deal with the foreign press, so we kind of ignored the foreign press, and that's something I wanted to change. Then there's a content issue. Japan used to be enigma, but it used to be powerful or influential enigma, but now we are losing that. So we are just a simply enigma, period, and no one may be interested in after all. So we really need to do something about it. The issues like climate change, it's probably the content. Is Japan's really seriously trying to tackle the climate change issue? The former Prime Minister Suga declared the carbon neutral. So now we are kind of being treated seriously. But before that, Japan was not seriously trying to deal with the climate change. So we need to really change the content. And now we are, before the COVID-19, we were opening up the country, and there's a lot of foreign travelers, and they see a lot of culture, food, a lot of things interesting in Japan, and that itself was sending message to the foreign countries. So after COVID-19, I guess we need to open up the country again, and we really need to show Japan is not just about Toyota and Sony, but there are a lot of history and a lot of interesting things in Japan. So there's a lot of things we need to do.
Thank you. It's interesting that you reflected back on the 3/11 experience. And at that time, I was asked quite often, is Japan doing a good job at communicating? And one of the key issues that I always identified was the fact that the daily press conferences are fronted by the cabinet secretary, and we're probably the only advanced nation in the world that doesn't use a press officer who is a professional PR person. We're using the cabinet secretary who also has a day job and is pretty busy, and we're asking him to do 2 extra press conferences a day. So they are necessarily rather brief, they are necessarily rather, there's very little context that's given. And what happens is after that, the media are taken back, and in the press clubs, the Japanese media are given a little bit more of a discussion or a lecture on the context to fill in. The foreign media didn't have access to that. And so they were just watching these very brief, very sort of top-line press conferences, and the impression that was left with them was Japan's hiding something. Japan's not going into detail. It's not giving us much detail. And so it was a function really of the methodology rather than the intent at that time. And I still think we are the only country in at least amongst the advanced countries, the major countries, that does not use press officers. The other thing that's really interesting is consistency of message. When a new administration comes into the White House obviously has their communications function, and there was that famous drama, The West Wing, which sort of highlighted that. But also they send a representative from the White House to each of the ministries, so that when the White House announces a new policy, the person in that ministry is communicating that in line with what the White House's intent is. In Japan, the ministries all give different perspectives. And so the Prime Minister comes out and says one thing, and then all the different ministries say something slightly different. And in a world of low trust, what happens is people look at that and just think, well, there's different messages, what's going on here? And I think there was a little bit of a sense of that during the COVID experience. Richard, you've talked a lot about the roles of CEOs in in contributing to the country brand in a sense. Can you perhaps give us a little bit more background on that?
So Ross, the sort of stunning finding of the 2021 January Trust Barometer was that business became the most trusted institution in the world for the first time. Historically, it's been NGOs. In the peak of COVID in May 2020, it was government because it was the only thing big enough to deal with the problem. But business in the last 2 studies we've done is the most trusted. And in fact, my employer is the most trusted by another 15 points over business. So trust becomes local. But the CEOs are supposed to talk up on behalf of their employees on diversity and inclusion, sustainability, vaccination, all sorts of other issues. And so what I find interesting in the moment is the extent to which American CEOs are speaking up. They started in 2017 after the Charlottesville riot to quit Trump's advisory board, Ken Frazier of Merck, among others. Then you saw CEOs speak up on January 7th after that horrible storming of the Capitol building to interrupt the Electoral College vote, just to say, come on, guys, we got to get on with the passage of the, of power. And so business is, after the murder of George Floyd, for instance, in the United States, every CEO had to write something, say something, do a town hall, calm down the African-American community. So the American CEO is all of a sudden really a politician. Now, that's at the bleeding edge. Where I think Japan should go is on issues such as sustainability, also on vaccination, for example. Japanese company CEOs have every right to speak up because they employ thousands of people all over the world. And that's the new expectation of the employee. I'll only work for a company whose values are harmonious with mine. And so I think Japanese, German CEOs have basically been quiet. And I don't think that's smart because the world is so politicized now that we need the voice of the CEO. Interestingly, Ross, my company newsletter is more trusted than mainstream media. It tells you everything. It tells you that because it's close to me, because I can evaluate the truth, because I'm sitting there at the company, then that's a huge statement. So Japanese companies really should step up now.
That concept of the proximity of trust, that trust is essentially local, Kono-san was referring it to in the plenary session when he was talking about how he worked with the mayors in the vaccination program, that it wasn't the central government because intrinsically the trust in the local mayors was much greater from the populace than the trust in the big government, and so that worked very well. Kano-san, in terms of, as a representative of the media, in getting access to CEOs and what Japanese CEOs are talking about, are they proactive, or are they I guess the word I want to use is competent, but I don't really want to use that word, in talking about some of these global issues and feel comfortable about talking about some of these issues?
I think it's a big step for Japanese CEOs to talk about political issues. I think generally the stance is staying quiet is the best strategy. And so, it's very rare for, other than maybe Mikitani-san, to speak. I mean, even SoftBank CEO Son-san would never speak about political issues. When asked about it, he'll avoid those issues. But I think it's true, like Richard was saying, that on vaccination or some of these other issues, CEOs can take a harder stance. And I remember I actually interviewed Kono-sensei about this as well. On the renewable, for example, strategy, there was a meeting with Sony and other corporate heads, where they told the government that, unless you take a really serious stance on increasing renewables, we actually may even have to move our manufacturing outside of Japan because, clients like Apple are asking our supply chains to be completely, 100% renewables. And so I think that's a very effective messaging to say how seriously our business is being affected by some of these, climate change strategies. But the other one on CEO interviews, as from a media perspective, I think traditionally there was not issue, actually, I shouldn't say that, but some companies tended to have, for example, this year-end interviews, or like when the new year begins, do you want to have a chat with the CEO? And those are usually on the assumption that if the CEO of our company speaks, then there should be news that you should be able to get out of that. But that's actually not the case anymore. Even for large companies like Toyota or Panasonic, it has to be put in the global context. Whatever a big company CEO says is not necessarily news. And so we find that we actually leverage the fact that we don't go to like the FT doesn't belong to a lot of press clubs, but we leverage these interviews where we, target interviews at certain timings when we believe that companies have a certain message that they want to deliver. And I think it would be more effective for companies as well if they have, for example, that, we want to deliver this message at this timing, and therefore we target this media. Rather than, just a random interview talking to every single media and saying, do you want to talk to our CEO at this timing? I think it would be a lot more strategic, effective, if companies, each of the companies can think in that way. That's just.
I liked Richard's wording. CEOs are politicians these days, and I think at the cutting edge in the United States, that is probably very true. Kono-san, do you think there is scope for the government in some way to collaborate or leverage captains of industry and those big CEOs in communicating more effectively the message of Japan, as Kana has said, on certain issues that the world is very, very concerned about? I once heard from someone at WEF many years ago, but when Japanese businessmen and politicians first started going to Davos, he said, it's great that everyone is coming to Davos, but there's a big issue. And I said, what's the issue? And he said, Japanese politicians and Japanese businessmen only talk about Japanese things. And it's the World Economic Forum. And so Angela Merkel is getting up there talking about global issues, and the Japanese Prime Minister talks about essentially Japanese economic issues. And so getting people to focus on those global issues, perhaps global CEOs of Japanese companies are a better way to do that.
That's one way. It's true. The Japanese politician changed the face quite often before Abe-san, right? Or after Abe-san, I mean, Suga government lasted 1 year. So maybe Toyota-san of Toyota is probably better known to the global community. So that's one thing. And the Japanese CEO, some of them are quite fluent in English and they can communicate. Many of the Japanese politicians speak in Japanese, so they need to have a translator. So at the podium, they might have interpreter, but they cannot mix with the global people at lunch, dinner, or coffee break. So sometimes the CEO may be a good communicator at a place like Davos. So more probably politicians, CEO should go out like a team and talk about not just about Japan, but our perspective about the global issue as a team.
Thank you. I'd like to, I don't tend to wait for question time. And so if anyone has a question or a comment on this particular topic, does Japan need to communicate better, or any of the comments that our panelists have made, feel free. Hands up.
Okay, thank you very much. This is Muto, and thank you very much for the messages. And what I felt is that it's a concern of the mindset. So we think global is somewhere abroad, but actually we are a part of the world. So that kind of mindset. We are in a global world, but we sometimes think the global is somewhere far from Japan, and that mentality or that mindset is creating that way of thinking as well as the activities. So what do you think about that, and how, if you have any recommendation to overcome, that will be appreciated.
I feel exactly the same way, and when I was a consultant at Edelman, I can't count the number of times I used to say to senior executives, global includes Japan. Global includes Japan. It's not international, it's global. It's global. Billie, yeah, how does Rakuten see the world in those terms?
Well, it's really sort of simple, but one thing I've been thinking about in the well, we're not quite post-pandemic yet, but one of the influences of the pandemic has been that we've gone to a lot more online communications. And sure, no one enjoys Zoom calls from morning to night, but one plus for media interaction, I think, is that in the past, in Tokyo in particular, companies felt they had a press conference in central Tokyo, they called everyone in, they did the press conference and they were done. And so if you didn't have a translator, even the foreign media in Tokyo often couldn't access the information. And of course, media outside Japan had real difficulty getting access to that corporate information. But because of the pandemic, we've had to rethink that, and Rakuten went really early to that. All our press conferences, all our events went fully online. And some of you may know we launched a mobile business not so long ago. And when we launched that mobile business, the technology behind it was world first. The technology behind it was cloud native, it was software based, it was really new. So we felt it was really important to share that technology with the world. We had special press conferences for telco media who were in the UK, in the US, in Singapore. And that was all possible because people became so much more comfortable with dialing into those things, having people translate, engaging on the chat. And I feel like that's probably, in a way, a good progress, and we're going to build on that.
It's really interesting stuff because it's about reach, right? In order to be global and have that global mindset, you need to be able to have global reach. And having a press conference in Tokyo and being limited by the physical elements of geography has now, through technology, been removed. And I think that's really interesting. On that same issue, Kono-sensei talked about Japan being an enigma. And I've been working in Japan now for decades. And when I first started working in Japan and you spoke to foreign executives, the common comment was, oh, Japan is just so different. It's so unique. It's, we don't really understand Japan. And as running businesses in Japan, you used to be able to get away with telling the CEO sitting somewhere in the rest of the world, oh, Japan's different. We can't do that here. And everyone used to say, yeah, I get that. With the globalization of the past 10 years, that has completely disappeared. And now if you go to a foreign CEO and say, well, Japan's different, the first thing he's going to come back to you with is, so is China, so is Azerbaijan, so is Germany, there's so much more experience out there in the world now of global that Japan is no longer seen as being unique or different because everywhere is understood to be unique and different. So Japan can't leverage that. So in one way, the global dynamic has become global, and they're saying, well, Japan is part of that, and it's all about diversity and inclusion. But Japan is still, well, they're there and we're here, and it's a little bit difficult to struggle with that global area. Kono-san, do you have any how does the government view, is it global, including Japan, and would that mindset allow Japan to participate in a lot more proactive and active way in the global conversation?
The former foreign minister of Korea, Kang Kyung-ha, she was running for the head of international organization. She lost one and she's running again. The Japanese politician never run for the office for the international organization. So it's like, UN, international, other international organization over there, we are here. And we are part of it. We are part of United Nations. We are part of WHO. We are part of UNHCR. well, Sadako Ogata got a top job, but she wasn't a politician. So I think the Japanese politicians need to think we are part of it. Why don't we run for the office? Or why don't we have someone get a top job in the international organization and get, things moving? I think we need to do that. Otherwise, we are just, we get a seat in UN, but that's about it. I think we need to go for the top job. So we are actually one of the big player in the global system. We are always part of the system, but we are not trying to run the system. And I think we need to change that mentality.
Excellent. So Kono-san's job after being Prime Minister is Secretary General of the United Nations. Okay, good. We have that career path planned then. No, I think it's a really valid point. There are many, many famous Japanese people who are sitting like Ogata-san or others. They tend to be bureaucrats, or they tend to be people who have come up through those organizations. But it's quite true. There's not that political. And if we don't have that political participation of people with experience in government, then it's hard for Japan to be expressing its ideas in a very effective manner. But at the same time, I think the new generation of politicians, of which you are one, we have now many politicians who speak English fluently. We have many who were educated overseas. And so in the terms of the trend we're going through, and I know we focus a lot, every time there's an election or the cabinet is announced, it's how many women do we have in the cabinet, and that is a very important thing. But it would also be nice for the LDP to go out and promote how many people English speakers, how many people in the minister have international experience, and sort of focus a little bit on that as well. I'd like to talk about influencers. And Richard has sort of said, and we've had a little bit of discussion about using CEOs and influencers, but there are a lot of very influential people around the world in many, many different areas. Do you think Japan can perhaps make more of an effort in terms of promoting itself to those influencers and having influencers tell the Japan story?
That's a really difficult question because I think from as a basic step though, it's quite sophisticated using influencers, I think, as a first step. And so I think it's similar to the targeting messaging, but you kind of have to know which influencer you want to use for which message and why you want to use it. So I think it's similar to the use of social media. Kono-sensei obviously is a huge presence on social media. And he's, obviously very good at using it. And other politicians have seen that and said, oh, let's use the social media, but they haven't used it effectively. And I don't think there are that many companies either who have been able to use it effectively. And so it's not really, there are influencers and there is social media, but you really have to use it in a way that is effective, or else it's actually going to be a big risk for companies or politicians as well. So I think for Japan, the first step probably would be figuring out how it wants to use it and in what ways they think that it would be effective, and what messages that they think that using influencers. I mean, figuring that first area would be probably the most important thing before just choosing like, oh, this influencer or that. I think that's really I guess the basic procedure that needs to be taken.
That is amazingly on point. When I went to Edelman, one of the big things that surprised me was that in my experience in Japan, when we talked about influencers, it was, oh, that person's popular now, why don't we go out and work with that person? And it wasn't really, there wasn't much analytical rigor behind why we were actually going to be using that person and what our expectations were and what the risk was. When I went to Edelman, they had done a huge program around influencers for, Richard, I think it was Unilever at the time. And And it went into all sorts of detail about, who this person was, what they were good at talking about, what their biases were from an analysis of social media, and a huge amount of detail, how approachable they were, whether they would be reliable in terms of communicating the message. And there was a huge amount of analysis that went into this project of, several hundred influencers around the world. And so I agree entirely with you that the kankaku approach, the instinct approach, needs to be replaced by an insights approach. Richard, the application of using influencers, I mean, corporates use influencers very well. In terms of national brands, can national brands, you think, also influence influencers in the same way as corporates?
So if I were Japan, I would be talking to experts, Carlo Ratti at MIT, who's an expert on cities, Richard Florida at University of Toronto about why companies' headquarters should be in certain cities. The Bloomberg Institute, which focuses on sustainability, again, on cities like this. I think Japan is off the radar for a lot of those influencers. Of course, everybody knows that there's a Tokyo, but we don't associate it with anything. It needs to also be in the cool factor. Ross, you'll remember we used that crazy YouTuber Casey Neistat for Samsung, flying around before Christmas with videoing himself on a frigging hang glider with green and red smoke coming out. I mean, Japan should stop taking itself so seriously. I think that if there's a hope for Japan, it's that it represents in a certain way the best of design. We work with ASICs, and they're a cool factor in that. And you have fashion brands, Uniqlo and others. I think somehow the reality is that the number of reporters is shrunken by half in the last decade because of the economics of the media business. So if you don't use influencers, completely missing a trick. The reality is it's not that people are using less media, they're using different media. They're using social media. And so if Japan is blacked out on having a bit of sense of humor and, here's Halloween in Tokyo, I don't know, whatever. Ross, when you took me to that place where the Buddhist shrine, the guy is taking the Shinto, box down. This whole idea of kind of medieval jousting. Who knew that existed? So this whole tradition and history and all this stuff is so incredibly important to connect with the rest of the world.
That's soft power. Before we go into a broader question session, I'd like to ask, or look at the issue of budget. Because a lot of this, of course, is how much can the government spend and how they should be spending it. Abe-san increased the national PR budget, or advertising budget it's called, by a significant amount during his tenure. I think the issue is it tended to be focused on events and advertising and a number of very specific issues, as Kono-san mentioned, territorial issues and culture issues, and perhaps not in the areas that people really want to access information in that sense. The other thing I sense is, while the total budget is quite large, it tends to be allocated out in lumps, and different companies get different lumps. And so there's very little consistency across that, and communications is effectively a momentum issue, right? You build momentum and you slowly increase. So all of these things should be assets to build to that momentum, but what tends to happen is they become objectives in themselves, and so they just become one-offs. Kono-san, is there scope for changing that budgetary system, or are we sort of locked into the way that is used?
Well, it takes a very strong person to change that system. I think that Prime Minister Abe wanted to promote history and territorial issue, and he put a big chunk of the budget into it. We built Japan House, three of them wasn't sustainable. We built it, but how we going to sustain the Japan House, there wasn't much strategy into it. So we really had to work hard on it. It's not just a global issue. You know, we had a vaccine rollout and wanted to put out some message to the young people. So we wanted to use the influencer, right? The first criteria is, would he do that pro bono? Or do we have to pay? And if you have to pay, well, sorry, we don't have budget. But we spend, you know, such a huge amount of budget in the vaccine rollout. So why can't we use some strategically and pay some amount, but send a good message across? Wasn't like that. So sending out a message, well, governments still don't really want to spend big money out of it. Well, one issue is it could be criticized. Why do we use this person and spend so much money, so much tax money, when this person would do that same thing for free? And well, we could say there's a strategy, or there's some, you know, building momentum on those things. But if it could be criticized in the parliament, well, why don't we, you know, spend less or spend free? So we need a very strong person who is determined to change our PR strategy as a government.
It's not easy. For corporate communications and public relations, the audience and the stakeholders are essentially 95% overlap, right? It's customers, it's shareholders, it's employees, it's partners and things like that. So the stakeholders are the same as the audience. In government communications, the audience and the stakeholders are different, particularly when you're looking at international, because the audience is the international community. The stakeholders are taxpayers. And so you have this very difficult dynamic where you have to be justifying to the stakeholders what you're trying to say and how you're saying it to the audience. And that is a very difficult dynamic to get across. Okay, online questions. I think we have.
Yes, we have one online question. Let me read it out. Having recognized that the tourism industry continues to be one of the few and growing industries for Japan, what can we do better when communicating to the world to promote Japan, especially in the era with and post-COVID?
Who would like to take that?
Well, Ross, I'm happy to. I did my honeymoon in Tokyo. I mean, in Japan. So I thank God for you, Ross, because you told me about Hokkaido. And you also told me about, I mean, the obvious is, you know, going to Nara and like this, Kyoto, but Japan also has an art island. And, you know, Japan has a whole dimension of interesting areas that, you know, are out of the normal. And I think you need more people like me to go talk about that. And what an extraordinary experience it was to stay in those, what did you call them in Hokkaido? The lodges, the small lodges. I almost gave the guy who did the green tea a heart attack because I didn't follow his ceremony, as you might expect. It takes too long. So I did it fast and I whipped it very quickly. But anyway, you need the third-party influencers who've had a good experience.
So the general themes of Japan, when you look at the tourism, tends to be Kyoto and autumn leaves and sakura and more or less the established themes, where in fact there are a lot of really great experiences that you can have in Japan from the experiential point of view that probably we can do a better job of pointing out to tourism. You know, I was in a taxi, must have been about 2 years ago now, and the taxi driver was telling me how the foreign visitors, particularly the backpackers, know more about the really delicious ramen shops in Tokyo than the taxi drivers. And he says they get in the taxi and they want to go to this really sort of hidden place in some place. And he said, the ramen, I tried it, it's absolutely amazing. And so we perhaps need to do a little bit more proactivity in terms of how we're advertising, that sort of thing. But once again, the budget tends to be concentrating on events and advertising and not using influencers to actually communicate that through. Anyone with another question? Yes.
Hi, I have a question, one comment and one question to Inagaki-san. One comment is that you mentioned about Son-san, who does not send any message, political message. But I think he does, in fact, act politically. That's one comment. My question is that regarding the responsibility of Japanese media for better international communication, and I would like to have your comment on that, because I sometimes see media reporting when, say, foreign minister, maybe Kono-san, or prime minister, who visit, say, UK, Russia. And those who followed on the same plane and interviewed them regarding not about UK, but not about Russia, but Morikake in Moscow. Or, you know, the political situation, domestic political situation in Russia, in London. And it sounds very ridiculous for us to listen to such questions abroad. What about, you know, internet relation between US and UK, Russia, territorial issues, things like this? I would like to hear. So, responsibility of Japanese media.
Perhaps Kano-san, and then Kono-san, I'm sure when you were foreign minister, you got asked lots of questions in the UK about local domestic politics, so maybe you can make a comment too.
That's a very difficult question. I don't really want to, I don't think I'm in a position to criticize how the Japanese media reports, but I do think that, well, obviously the audience is domestic, and so everything, you know, they ask about is, I mean, not everything, but they do tend to focus domestically. And also I think that's partly also to do with their online strategy as well. The Japanese media still don't have a very big presence online, and so it's actually hard to reach any of the audience other than Japan. And so there's natural tendency, and I also think there's also probably historical relationships. So source building in Japan is, I think, built especially, I think, in politics, and maybe Kono-sensei can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's very tied to how much you can become close. It's almost as if your career is tied to a politician. So if you're covering one politician, depending on that politician's career, your also reporter's career is also linked in some aspects to that as well. And so it's a very different dynamics than the international media. And so I think it's a bit, I'm not saying it's correct or anything like that, but it's, you can't really attach the same kind of expectations, you know, with how the international media operates, because it's just fundamentally a different kind of relationship that people build with sources. But yeah, I don't know if I want to go too much into it.
Yep. Lives of the Japanese reporters are quite short. The reporters, when they reach a certain age, they tend to move into the management. So the reporters who follow me as a foreign minister was very young, and they probably don't know anything about UK or Russia, or I doubt they knew Russian history or things like that. So the proximity to the politicians they cover is the key issue. So it's not like They are interested in covering international affairs, but they are trying to cover what he does, what he thinks. And so I think the Japanese media should keep the good reporter as they age, so they know more about the issues, more about the background, and they can probably write better. But the career path for the reporters in Japan is they tend to sideline and they don't write article, then they move into the management. And I mean, most of the newspaper, their management is not quite good. I mean, they are not coping with digitalization and they are losing circulation. I think the reporter should be a reporter, and they should recruit a better management from somewhere else.
Very, very good
I hope
point.
there's no reporters here.
We had one question.
Thank you. This is a
Minutes
bit,
left, so keep it.
yes, a bit overarching question. Japan and digital diplomacy, and to throw in something, is there a country besides Japan who is doing a very good job on digital diplomacy?
Not quite sure. Sorry. Sorry.
Richard, any countries that you think are doing really good at digital diplomacy?
I think two are. I think in a certain way, the U.S. and China, because they're the ones that are providing the platforms, whether it's TikTok or Facebook or or Instagram, that are the basis of communication for 12 to 30-year-olds. And so, Japan's not in that game.
Perspective. Yes.
Thank you very much for the great comments. My name is Taka, and I am a surgeon at a university hospital in Tokyo called Tokyo Medical and Dental University Hospital. And I'm questioning about digital health. And so I studied public health in the USA last year, and I encountered the COVID pandemic there. And comparing Japan and the US situations, I'm really wondering why the digital health is not really prevalent here in Japan. And I think it's partly related to the trust for the media in Japan, because there are tons of information. So the question is, maybe Kono-san, what would you think the solution for help people to use the digital solution in healthcare field?
Well, number one, the hospitals have a digital system, but it's sort of uniquely tied to the vendors. So it's very difficult to cross-analysis. Number two, there's one organization, Shiharai Kikin, get digital data, but they simply check if what hospital been doing is according to the standard or not. We are trying to move this Shiharai Kikin to data health slowly. And they say there's a trust issue, but I think it's fairly bullshit. I mean, if you take the name and age and address out of it, I mean, it's quite difficult to connect data to each individual, so it'll be anonymous, and it's quite useful to analyze those data. They could do that, or they could provide to the scholars who wanted to do it. Now, there's a way to do it, but it takes time, and there's a lot of restrictions. So we are trying to move that so we can cut the health cost.
Okay, and that brings us to the end of today's session. Everyone, please, a round of applause for these great panelists, Richard, Billie, Hannah, and Kono Sensei.